And now it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Gaia Taffoni, Research Fellow at the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute in Florence. So, Gaia, please welcome. The Zoom room is yours.
Thank you very much, Kalle. Just double checking that you can hear me well.
Yes, perfect.
All right. And good afternoon, everyone. I am connecting from Florence, from Italy. And it is really, really a big pleasure for me to be here virtually with this community that is I mean the not my common community, a community of designers. I am a political scientist by training, and I do work on public policy. So why this is interesting? Because the topic, and this is my research agenda that I will introduce today, in a way, what governments are struggling with today is precisely a design problem. So we will approach this from, I would say, a different perspective, but still we're dealing with a design kind of issue. We are, in fact, living in an incredible time, in a moment where the piece of change has really overtaken the piece of policy, in a sense. So we have climate shocks, AI, political tensions, demographic decline, and all these forces really don't wait for the kind of institutional time and routines. And this means just one thing, that the traditional logic of planning policies is really no longer enough. And let's say that across Europe, but also beyond Europe, governments are really trying to redesign exactly how they think, how they build knowledge, how they, let's say, at the end of the day, they make decisions, they govern under this incredible, deep, uncertain context. So this is where exactly anticipation and anticipatory governance and policy meet. And what I will do today is to try to unpack this intersection, right? On the one hand, anticipation, foresight, and policy design, to really show what governments are already doing, what still is not working properly, and why a design perspective can really make a difference if nicely implemented. And hopefully I will take you to the tools, the cases, the challenges that I've seen in my research, me and my, of course, co-author. So I will move to the first slide where I tried to give a visual to begin with. Since this seminar is really trying to explore how anticipatory governance and policy design do interact and why this matters now, I think that we can start from these three pictures that show the uncertainty that is really the new normal in the way in which, I mean, governments are working every day. So we have the climate shocks, we have technology, but also migration. And the point I think that's interesting to start with is that governments do need something new. They do need some kind of cognitive tools, and not just, kind of plug-in tools, but some of continuous sense making and learning and adapting. And the design problem is at the core, in a sense, because today the institutions are not designed for a world that is actually non-linear, that is complex and is full of what we call a wicked kind of problem. So let's start from a story, one very brief story to again frame our problem correctly. This is a story of the unprepared bridge. Maybe you already know this. In the Netherlands, there is a famous infrastructure case that I found very useful to start with. A bridge that was planned in the early 2000s, using, of course, the data that were there at the time, so past traffic data. specifically. And the designer used 10 years of very solid evidence and knowledge. But there was one thing that was missed at the time, because then was the explosion of new mobility patterns. And so by the time that the bridge was finally finished and opened, the traffic flows were really outdated. So it had been perfectly planned for past knowledge, but for a world that no longer existed when it was actually inaugurated. So this is just to say that evidence for policymaking is essential, but without anticipatory and design thinking, the risk is that we build perfect solutions like the Dutch case, the Netherlands case with the bridge, but we built something that is perfect for yesterday's problems and not for today's problem. So let's underline again the fact that policy environments have become ever so complex, so fast, so uncertain, to stick with a kind of what we call reactive kind of governance. And this is something the OECD has highlighted clearly and is very, very much focused on trying to put forward also an agenda for anticipatory governance, as we will see in a second. So current policy making operates, as we have said already, in a very complex, uncertain, and multicultural context. Crises that are linked to climate change, migration, but even the pandemics, they are somehow increasingly, and we expect this to be increasingly frequent and destructive. So the classical approach of governments are all level, national, regional, municipal, supranational level of we wait for a problem, we wait for the crisis to arrive, and then we find a solution is really not available strategy. So governments somehow should and try to anticipate the possible future and act now to design policies that are really, really anticipatory. So the question is the following. Is not really whether governments should anticipate or not. This is forgiven, right? Governments need to anticipate, and they do want to anticipate. The problem, and this is what we are interested in, is how they are doing it and how they should do it to do it better. So specifically, what kind of structures, what kind of tools, policy tools, what kind of routines allow government to be good at anticipating in a consistent way and in a way that really is not episodically, but is really intrinsic in their culture, institutions in general. So this is what we are assisting as a global movement, a global shift towards what the OECD has defined as the anticipatory innovation governance. Here, I want to highlight the fact that it's not just anticipatory governance, but talking about anticipatory innovation governance is a more general and systemic view on anticipatory governance, because it's about the capacity to explore possibilities. So here you see foresight thinking, but also to experiment. I see here a lot of policy labs emerging, also as governments' policy tools, but also to learn in a continuous way. This really puts the pressure on co-production of knowledge and continuous learning also at the level of policy making. So in a way, anticipatory innovation governance, defined by the OECD as the broad-based capacity to be actively in exploring these possibilities, this experimentation, this continuous learning, but it's really a way to institutionalize the citizen involvement, the experimentation, the exploration of alternative future. And this is the problem, the institutionalization of all of this. There are some cases, though, interesting ones, some champions, I would call them, of anticipatory innovation governance. We start with Finland. Finland is a great case because I think that is a case of a country that does not treat foresight as a, again, one-off exercise that some units do sometimes at some level, but is really an example of an embedded in governance fabric at all levels. So just few example of Finland, the National Foresight Network that is coordinated by the Prime Minister's Office and CITRA, the agency, that links all ministries, the agencies, the regions, so you see also different levels, companies, academia, NGOs, to organize these monthly Foresight Fridays that is really about this continuous learning and also literacy about foresight and anticipation, where they convene diverse actors to share signals, explore scenarios, and then build a culture and a capacity of anticipation. So, for instance, before the elections, the network produced forward-looking scenarios for digitalization, aging, labor, societal change. We will see a few of these examples. For example, the commitment of Finland to carbon neutrality, that of course is just not one topic, but requires the integration of different sectors, economic, fiscal, policy, more specific policy decisions. Carbon neutrality, in fact, is the classical wicked problem, which is a problem that is very complex because it has a lot of interdependencies with other sectors. Also, we don't have all information, so incomplete and perfect information about a wicked problem. And also, there is no optimal solution ahead. So it's really about trial. It's really about rethinking and redesigning always the solutions to problems that come ahead with these kind of wicked problems. So 4 Finnish ministries collaborated again here with the OECD on the carbon neutrality to incorporate uncertainty into the fiscal modeling and strategic planning. This is really a future-driven example of policy design where there was stress testing policies, mapping alternative pathways, and preparing continuously for the discontinuities that were arising. Another great example that I like to mention on the Finnish case is the Continuous Learning Center. So when Finland basically realized that digitalization and aging population were reshaping the labor markets faster than the cycle, the political cycle. Here we have 2 different timings. On the one hand, the wicked problem kind of timing, which is very, very fast paced. And then we have the time of politics, and they are not going together. So basically, they didn't write a strategy on the labor market that was just leave it there on a shelf, but they built this continuous learning center, which is a place where workers with policymakers, with employers, so a big, big group of stakeholders of different entities, educators, of course, they meet, they experiment with the new learning models, and then update continuously their knowledge about this problem. So it's not a finished project, but it's a habit and a routine, an institutionalized way, I would say, of anticipating. But it's just not Finland, one of the champions in Asia. So we have South Korea, Singapore. I just learned about this case of Singapore a few days ago, where thanks to their anticipatory culture and governance, for instance, in the new buildings, they decided to build garage for cars that are at least 3 meters high, because they're not expecting that the way in which people, I mean, they buy and they have cars is gonna continue in this way. So probably there are gonna be differences in the way in which citizens do move around. So the new spaces for cars can also be reused if they are at least 3 meters higher for different purposes in the future, like shops or apartments, for instance. So this is again another example of anticipatory and in practice and investment really in scenarios development, skills anticipation. And then I also mentioned Netherlands, Germany, Spain, France, the EU as a case. Of course, you don't see, for instance, Italy, but we will. I think I will talk about this case in a bit. So just to mention a few other examples in the Netherlands, I don't know if you ever heard of the Polder model. So this is, I think, a very strong example of, again, anticipatory governance that is driven by societal consensus, institutionalized foresight, and also legal commitments, because this whole system anticipatory structure in the Netherlands feel around climate issues. So they had national climate agreement that used this Polder model, which is basically is a way to do a deliberative system, like also citizen assemblies, for instance. That however really brings a lot of state, business, union, civil society together to negotiate these long-term decisions. And then they came up with a Climate Act that established these long-term reduction targets, and also, it's interesting, an anticipatory monitoring system. So with the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency that is published every year and is really looking and analyzing climate and energy transitions to check whether the targets that they set of 2050 are on track. It's not just, okay, we have these targets and we will, do these steps. No, every year we try to reconsider and basically reshape where we are going, what we are doing in a very participatory way. Also, the UK is a great example, one of the champions, again, of anticipatory governance. Together with the Netherlands, they both developed these future scenarios for child and family protections, a vision for, again, thanks to multi-stakeholders consultations across different ministries, municipalities, NGOs, social workers. And again, important, it's not a fixed plan, but it's something that is, again, built on a shared vision of the future and is constantly developed. This is very important, and we'll see now in a bit why this is a very good cases of anticipatory governance. This is a table where I try to put everything together, but these are just examples. There are many others, and these are examples from the studies of the OECD on anticipatory innovation governance. Okay, so we have already started with with a bang on with a lot of cases. Let's pause for a second to gather what we have discussed and seen so far. We have started again with the problem, with the wicked policy problems. Sorry, I just was listening to something. Governments that more and more face today. Then we have seen that governments are nonetheless trying to put in place, and we will see a little bit more on that, ways to anticipate rather than react to changes. We've seen that, for instance, the OECD, but not only, we also have the EU, World Bank, other international organizations that are very active in that, and they are defining this attempt as anticipatory innovation governance system. There are some champions on this. This is really about foresight and policy making at the end of the day. It is about experimenting as well with continuous learning, with labs, with participation, with co-creation of knowledge. Now we shift a little bit our perspective and we consider the fact that we need to know a little bit more about these policies, no? Because we are discussing anticipation and policy making, how these policies are made. What is policy design, and what is policy design telling us about how policies are approaching this problem, or the objective of anticipation. Policy design is really a useful approach that gives us at least the grammar, the building blocks of how policies do come to life. So before we look into foresight more specific, we need to understand a little bit more about this grammar. So we do start from the foundations of policy design and public policy making. They do matter because, of course, anticipatory governance fails precisely when these foundations of policy design and policy making are very weak. For instance, you cannot really anticipate well as a government if the problem is defined poorly, if the instruments, the policy instrument don't fit with the system, or if the implementation is just, an afterthought and is not really designed properly. So all this attention to the future regarding policy making, policy initiative, really then risk to fail, to remain a little bit superficial. We know that anticipation, as policy analyst, anticipation works only when it is embedded in some kind of governance routines. So the system that the OECD was talking about, in a sort of organizational memory, and also, very important, in political and administrative practices. So the practice of anticipatory governance and anticipatory policy making cannot just be considered good practices, tools that plug in and you have anticipatory governance. This is absolutely a problem of model, of imitation. We see Finland in Italy, and we try to replicate exactly what Finland is doing. This is absolutely not the case. And policy analysis and policy design really tell us a little bit more about this, because we are very much interested, we and the scholars of policy design in general have been also in the past very much interested in understanding exactly how to design better policies that are more efficient. So far, this scholarship has gathered some interesting insights that are now going to be discussed by me. Of course, this is not a master course on policy design and policy analysis. So in 1 hour, I will try to just give you a little bit of information and knowledge around it, and then how this translates into anticipatory policy making. So let's start with this more, I hope not too boring part on public policy analysis and policy design. So let's start from this, I think, interesting fact that policy design is really, yes, is an umbrella term that describes the act of defining the aims of the policies and the tools of the policies that are set to deliver the aim of a policy. That's very easy. Another important and interesting point that policy design is teaching us is that policy design is not something optional for government. It's not a set of knowledge that an analyst can bring to a government. Governments do policy design nonetheless. It is really intrinsic in the art of governing. There is a problem, governments need to act on it. And it is, of course, a policy design exercise. So governments have always engaged in some kinds of efforts to match the goal with the means that they have, using knowledge, using experience, but also moving in a very messy context. And this is where policy design is trying to make a little bit more a systemic assessment. What is the space in which governments are moving, policymakers are striving not to find a solution to a problem? So here I think some interesting definitions of great scholars of policy design. So policy design is an activity that is conducted by a group of actors to pursue improved policy processes for better outcomes for society. Through the accurate anticipation of the consequences of government actions and the articulation of specific courses of action to be followed. So you see, there is some kind of ready of striving to do something better. This is, again, the art of policy design, very traditional understanding. Another important aspect, if this is all clear, I hope. So, what is a policy? The object of our study. What is a policy? First of all, a policy is not a singular object of study. A policy is a configuration of a lot of elements. Policies contain at least three levels inside the macro, so the abstract goal, then the meso, you have the instruments, the objectives of the program, and then also micro level, very interesting one, all the settings of the tools, the calibrations. And these layers, they should at least work together well in a coherent way for a policy to be effective and overall good. Let's look at an example. The example, the EU electric vehicle strategy. Good example. So I put it here at macro, meso, and micro level. So at the macro level, policymakers, they do set some kind of abstract overarching goal. We want the decarbonizing mobility as part of the European Green Deal. So we want emission reductions target by 2030. This is the macro level that defines the direction of, let's say, of the mode of governance. So a mix of EU coordination and national implementation. Then we move a step down, the meso level. So the broad vision becomes more a concrete mix of policy. So here we find the key instruments, for instance, the regulatory standards for the car manufacturers, the decision to phase out combustion engines with combustion, or the tax incentives to buy a new car and to support the research and development of batteries. These instruments basically are translating the vision of the European Green Deal into programs that can be actually shape the behavior overall. And then we move again a little bit down at the micro level, and here is really about the performance of the policy. Really depends on the settings, on the calibrations of these instruments. For example, how how high are the subsidies for the car manufacturers? How dense is the network of the charging networks in a country, in an area? These are important calibration of these tools. So small changes at this micro level can really make the entire policy effective or not, or for instance, cause it to stall or to fail whatsoever. So really, the message I think is that these layers need to work together, and it's very difficult. And if we have a strong macro goal like the European Green Deal has, it can fail if the meso and the micro level is poorly chosen, is not working well, or if the calibration of the micro level somehow undermine also the uptake of the policy. So these layers must be coherent with them. So policy design is already depicting quite a dense picture about the policies. The main elements of the very traditional understanding of policy design are, I think, the following. So important to have a problem setting and good problem definition, the so-called agenda setting stage, a good theory of change, then select good policy instruments and tools, have an implementation theory, and then set up some strategies for policy designing, like lesson drawing, policy transfer, pilot, labs. These are also strategy for policy designing, then decision-making process and strategy to overcome any kind of barriers to have it approved, and then also the communication aspect of a policy that is important. So the first and most important aspect is problem setting, or the definition of the problem. Really, really the crucial, the core step of a good policy design, because this is really the moment where you shape and give reason for the work that you want to do as a policymaker, and giving a sense of the direction for evidence gathering, data collection, etc. And also, you can understand that this is the moment where you shape also the story and the strategy that you want to put forward. For instance, city mobility and bike sharing. The issue can be framed, the problem can be framed as lack of bikes, or the streets are unsafe, or public unwillingness to use bikes. So this is really important how you decide to frame the problem, because it determines whether you buy bikes, you redesign the streets, or you launch some kind of safety campaigns. So very, very important aspect not to be missed. Then the tools. This is very, very interesting, because the tools can be solutions, the so-called policy tools, or even more specific policy instruments. You can also find it. We will see now the categorization by Hood. That is, I think, very, very clear. Hood categorized these policy tools as nodality, so it's about sharing of information, authority, laws, regulations, guidelines, or tools as treasure, so it's allocation of money and resources, organizational tools, so about allocation of the staff, but also behavioral now and psychological tools are very important. Just mentioning, for instance, nudge, which is a very interesting and very much considered policy tools. So just to move on the categorization of tools, I hope you can see it well. So you see economic tools, they can be grants, subsidies, taxes, expenditures, incentives, like we see in the case for electric vehicles, or of course the legal tools, regulations, guidelines, administrative circulars, codes, or more or less relaxed public procurement requirements. Then the part about the psychological level, so information, nudge, naming and shaming, managerial tools, benchmarking, toolboxes, risk assessment, self-reporting, and then more on the control side, monitoring is also a policy tool, enforcing sanctions or reduction of sanctions. These are, I think, good examples for. Another important lesson of policy design is that this action that governments do of policy design is always constrained, is not on a blank page. There are, first of all, existing laws, institutions. So there is already a space in which governments are acting. Even if you have a new government or new politicians, they still need to act inside a space that is predefined. There are different governance regimes from a legalistic point of view, corporatist market networks, and then there is also an historical context, layering, drift, and all these factors, they do count a lot for the success or the failure of a policy. Here I start to do the cases on Italy that I just know well because I'm Italian and I still live in Italy. So a good policy idea, or the same policy idea, like for instance, the minimum income program had very different outcomes. For instance, in Italy, it was not a very successful one because of administrative fragmentation that we do have in Italy, strong distrust in political institutions, corruption, but also a limited capacity in implementation at the regional level of this policy. Whether, for instance, France has a long tradition of income support program. So the minimum income policy was more successful than in Italy. Again, Finland, where there is a strong municipal capacity, for instance, made pilot experiments on this more feasible. So policy ideas, they do travel a lot, but then whether they work or not really depends on a lot of the items that we call design space. So let's look a little bit more at the design space in which policies are embedded. So some of the limits and the constraints for policymakers. So this is, I think, very important point that policy change is not always, it's not that easy. Policy change is usually incremental. All the new policies, they do tend to be in a sticky environment, again, with all the traditions and laws and institutional setting. So the change is very, very much incremental. There is also the expression of muddling through of a new idea. And major reforms, in fact, are exceptions. They're not the rule, as some maybe politicians try to frame it. Another important aspect is to think that policymakers are human beings, so they have no perfect rationality. They do act with a bounded rationality instead. So they cannot possibly have and collect all the important evidence and piece of knowledge around a policy problem. So they have a limited, of course, understanding of a problem. They have their own biases, their own values, and sometimes they also rely on some kind of cognitive shortcuts to make a decision. Could be also a gut feeling about what to do. And then again, there is an institutional setting. So policymakers operate in systems that they cannot fully control. There are limits, things they cannot control, even the policy entrepreneur and policy makers per se. So key features of the space, again, of the policies. There are many actors. We think that there is just one decision maker. No, there are several policy makers, there are policy influencers, there are analysts, there are knowledge brokers, there are consultants. There are different venues in which the policy is made, different levels and types of government. Let's think again of the climate policy and the EU emission reduction. Climate policy doesn't happen in one place in the Commission, but across many, many venues. You have the Commission, you have the Parliament, the Council, the Member States, the national environmental ministries, the different actors. You have energy agencies, industry association, NGOs, citizens. Then ideas. There are dominant ideas and different interpretations of problems and solutions. And then there is also the context and the opportunity sometimes in which policies are developed and implemented. Different socioeconomic conditions, crises, political elections. Let's remember of the timing of politics and policy. They do not run at the same pace. And then also implication, because again I said, there is not just one single center of control, as in the case of climate policy, there is not just the Commission. The responsibility for tools, for instance, also depends on different systems, like national system for this case. So sometimes policy tools, even if they are well designed, well selected, they don't work sometimes as they are intended. Sometimes, and you maybe start to understand that the link between this tool is gonna bring this kind of outcome, well, it's not that straightforward and it's unclear. Again, it's often non-linear because there are different moment actors and contexts that do intervene. This is, I think, also important. Classic implementation studies highlight that there are some inevitable gaps between the intended and the actual outcomes. There are policies which were not, maybe they are successful, but they were not designed with that intentional outcome. And another interesting thing out of complexity theory says that outcomes usually emerge more locally from the interaction in complex systems that nationally or centrally. So central government control sometimes is very limited and real outcomes emerge locally. Okay, so policy analysis, policy design, and process research, they tell us all this interesting insights and fact for a better design of policy. And this can be seen as two different traditions that are also mutually reinforcing. So on the one hand, policy analysis provides with these functional requirements of what analysis should ideally do, and the policy process research provides more a realistic kind of capacity. So what analysts can actually achieve within this bounded rationality, limited resources, distributed authority, and very complex environments. So these approaches of policy design, they do offer a realistic model, I think, of policy making, a better understanding of where design can make a difference. And also, I think, is providing us the information of a new role for policy analysts and also for policy designers as knowledge brokers. So knowing about the limits, knowing about the complexity of the system is really a added value for policy analysts that do give this information to, again, policymakers that have little time, bounded rationality, and they need to take decisions right away. So I think it's very interesting to think about the role of knowledge brokers for policy analysts. Policy analysis and policy design nowadays has taken a new shape along with this anticipatory culture. What does it look like? So instead of imagining, so the policy analyst, an ideal linear design, so this is the policy problem, these are the tools, this is the outcome. Policy analysis is trying to navigate exactly the messy, complex system and wicked problems. And from assuming exactly a rational control of the policies, trying to work and make peace with the boundary rationality of policy actors. And from more a centralized kind of problem solving, so policies are designed and implemented at the central level, trying to distribute and be more adaptive also in the design of the policy tools, for instance. So thinking of, okay, laws, regulations, but also more experimental, co-designing kind of processes. And then from a technical optimization, we need policies that are more efficient. Well, also thinking of policies that are, again, anticipatory and trying really to work with different network of actors, of experts. So this is more or less the foundation of the modern policy design, or the new policy design approach, also called evidence 3.0 or evidence for impact 3.0. So now we are really putting emphasis a lot on stakeholder participation in every step of policy making, co-production of knowledge rather than governmental actors per se, picking pieces of knowledge here and there and being the only responsible for the policy outcome. So what policy designers, the new approach, tell us is that there is a need to focus on alternative solutions rather than single policy problems, single solutions. And policy actions are aimed at opening up policy problems to many inputs and avoiding closures as much as possible. I see one comment in the chat. I take this No, no, sorry. So it was probably just a dream. So I shall continue. Um, okay. This new, again, more modern approach to policy design and the actors and that are foreseen are, so who designs the policy do matters. So of course core actors and policy makers, but also external experts, think tanks, epistemic communities, communities of practices. These actors should be taken into consideration in the policy process because they shape paradigms, the stories they bring, the preferences, and the insights. So, tools, just to sum up so far a little bit on the lessons on policy design and policy analysis, don't work, policy tools don't work as they are intended because reality is non-linear. Reality is complex. Is crowded with a lot of actors and seems resistant to be controlled. So the traditional model of policy analysis, policy design are just not longer enough to tell us the whole story about how to design better stories. So we can keep pretending that policies are linear, the context is clear, from the pipeline from designing to delivery. So we do need an approach that reflects on the way governments work in practice. So this is our step to focus now our seminar on the aspect of strategic foresight in policy making. So we are going a little bit more in depth. So once we accept, in fact, that policy making is messy, policy making is decentralized, shaped by boundary rationality, then the task of design changes as well. And policy design can no longer be a technocratic top-down process, but it must be a collective process, an adaptive process, opening up problems, bringing in diverse actors that work in an iterative way on solutions rather than searching for one perfect solution, and that's it. So, with strategic foresight in the policy making cycle, we are just, focusing on one more specific aspect of what I already described in the general policy analysis and policy design perspectives. So let's start from this question, why governments in general use strategic foresight? Of course, to trying to be more anticipatory. That would be the easy answer. But it's clearly becoming a support for defining policy contents and trying to manage this uncertainty and this complexity, trying to considering the effects of what is unforeseen, and assessing the unintended consequences of the strategies, and then also identifying not the priority, the emerging issue, the so-called early warning in a foresight language, or weak signs, and then integrate all of this knowledge in more long-term horizons for their actions. The problem is, and this is what we are reflecting also with my colleagues and analyzing so far, is the problem that this is still a characteristics in many public administrations, governments more in general. There is a problem of using the knowledge and the approach of foresight in government. The problem of turning insights about the future into action, of converting the scenarios, the signals, the trend, but even the reports that are sometimes published on foresight into concrete policy. So first of all, there is a problem of communication. that is given for granted, because foresight results seems to be in few cases poorly communicated, or they do appear for the nature to be too abstract for a policy system that requires answers, sometimes concrete and precise answers. But I think it's also important the legitimacy aspects, because if foresight exercises are not done and designed in a very inclusive way, so there is, for instance, a limited involvement of some officials, some departments, stakeholders, there is also a low legitimacy, and so also a small political ownership. And foresight sometimes risks being seen more as a technocratic burden that is added rather than something that is very strategically relevant, cognitive knowledge. I mean, to expand the reach of a policy. Then again, and these are the lessons that we learn from what I said, from policy design and public policy analysis, there are strong organizational barriers. This is something I am looking once here in the Italian case, for instance, and listening to the problems of integrating foresight to the actions of government, is the strong serialization culture of public administration in general. They are not built, departments, for exploration. There is also a very strong hierarchy within departments. So the interdisciplinarity also of works remain very difficult inside administration, public administrations. Also, there is, and we will see this in a bit more in depth, the problem of the evidence that foresight creates. It's not traditional evidence, it's not the result of a cost-benefit analysis, right? So the uncertainty and non-familiarity of policymakers with the methodology of foresight, but also with the kind of knowledge that foresight provides, feels really less solid, less reliant compared to more traditional analytical tools that are used in policymaking. And then also, yes, a problem of capacity and resources more in general, because there are few resources sometimes allocated to do foresight. And then, of course, there is a very limited skills inside the government on who is doing foresight, and for what purposes. There are two ways, and these are my colleagues that have been working on this, so Laura De Vito and Claudio Radaelli, on doing strategic foresight in government so far. One is to have and establish units. These are recognizable units, sometimes within cabinet offices, government departments, ministries. They have the responsibility of leading foresight. For instance, the NATO has its own unit, no, of foresight. That is understandable. So they deal with megatrend reports. They do translate also the local context. They link also with other civil servants, politicians. Another way of doing this is in the so-called embedded foresight. So it's more a diffuse application of foresight to individual policies and interventions. So here you need to have people in-house that are at least have an understanding, or they are aware, or they know how foresight works, and they identify the risk and opportunities, and then ultimately produce better policies. These two kind of configurations have different advantages and, of course, disadvantages. Decentralized, having a unit on foresight, of course, provides a more strategic vision. Also, I think more legitimacy of having a unit on foresight. And then it can also be maintained in every kind of situation, even in situation of crisis or emergency. so-called a protected space. But the disadvantage is, of course, that there is a little bit of disconnection from the policy cycles, especially in systems which are very siloed and hierarchical, like, for instance, Italian traditional systems. Instead, the configuration of embedded foresight in governance, the advantage clearly is better adaptability to the different situation, be more flexible. It can be directly used in different processes of decision making. But then there is the risk of fragmentations, of skills, of resources. Sometimes you have people that are willing to work on that, or sometimes not. In moments of crisis, maybe there is no time, there is no willingness to do that. And then it really depends on the leaders of that lead the process of strategic foresight. And then there is the risk, of course, of foresight be sidelined if there are crises or emergencies. This is something that we are also working on from a public policy and policy design perspective, trying to understand what our sector is doing with foresight. So what is foresight for policy analysis in general? It's an instrument, clearly, but it's also a capacity of the administration, but it's also just understood as a process, like the embedded way of doing it. But this is important because we have identified a few interesting gaps in how foresight is being used in policy making. So governments are clearly growing. Generally, this is the tendency that we observe, these future-oriented capacities within the anticipatory governance efforts. And for instance, they produce a lot of strategic foresight reports that can really also influence the public debates. But when you look at the really uptake of this kind of knowledge, of the tools, different tools of foresight, well, this is not very much integrated. So here we are with my colleague, we started a reflection on the very specific policy tools. Policy tools have a dimension of foresight in it. So I sometimes give for granted that we understand what is a policy cycle and the different steps. So before looking at different policy tools, let's look again at the policy cycle. We have the first step, as I said, the agenda setting. Then there is the formulation of a policy. Here, the policy tool that is used is usually the ex ante impact assessment or regulatory impact assessment. It can be named in different ways. Then there is the adoption of a policy, the implementation. Then there is the evaluation after some time. And here you have the tool of ex post evaluations. And then there is support maintenance changes. And then again, you start with a new policy or a renewed policy. So here you have different tools. We have started the reflection on looking exactly at the first tool, this one, the impact assessment in the formulation stage. These are the tools that are also preached and described by the better regulation agenda of the Commission, but also member states have established a better regulation agenda and set of better regulation tools. Well, traditional tools, of course, they are not designed to have an anticipatory dimension in it. When looking at impact assessment, I mean, this is the kind of tool that is focusing on the present. So what is the impact of this policy? So I look at now and try to think of the impact in a very limited time span. So it's really focusing on the present using the knowledge from the past. So it's really not future based. So this is a short publication that we have done looking at a lot of impact assessment. And usually they do not really incorporate future thinking in it. We're seeing also in horizon scannings. They do mention foresight a lot, but they are not really incorporating a future dimension in terms of the knowledge that is used to produce this impact assessment documentation. So this is exactly what we said, that even this very specific tool must be complemented by foresight, knowledge, and also more experimental governance approach. These are very important tools for accountability, for proportionality, but they still cannot really anchor an innovative governance regime on their own, also because they don't have, for instance, a future regarding kind of perspective. So in order to really work in a new context and in the context of anticipatory governance, even tools like regulatory impact assessment or just impact assessment must be informed by the inputs, the outcomes of a foresight process. So then we looked at the last tool of the cycle, which is the ex post evaluation with my colleague. And we look at that. So when embedding foresight in the policy cycle, what we observed is sort of a cosmetic, that's how we call it, use of foresight. Just to mention it, just risking to become like an empty exercise at a certain point that is put inside these tools, right? So when we looked at the ex post evaluation, well, we didn't find much foresight. So foresight is more applied during the agenda setting, sometimes impact assessment, even if not so much, but not in the last round of policy of the policy cycle. So it's really very weak in the phase of evaluation where there is actually the assessment of what worked and what did not work and what we can do to make this policy better. Here is where really there is the need for knowledge about the future. And in cases in which we found that foresight was used in ex post evaluation, still the consultations that were done for the evaluation of policies were very rare, and governments were not really bringing number of voices and different perspective into this process. So the challenge is, okay, how foresight then can be really embedded in public governments more in general. So we do think that there is a need to focus more on internal community of practices, of literacy, of peer learning networks within government's unit. And it must be understood not only as a tool, not only as a process, but as a capacity of administration, as administrative capacity. And therefore need to strengthen this future literacy with more training, with more exercises, with more experimentation on this. And then to better connect foresight outputs to the existing strategies of different governments, to the policy cycle and the different mandates. Also rely on foresight champions to break skepticism about the legitimacy of this tool. And then an important aspect, that's why I found it difficult, for instance, in some jurisdictions to promote a multi-level and interdepartmental collaborations to produce foresight and anticipatory knowledge. And then also evaluate how foresight influences actions or not. The problem here, we are reflecting lastly on foresight and policymaking. It is really about the kinds of knowledge that foresight produce. Is it useful? Do policymakers understand it? What is the problem behind it? Now, we know that foresight produces some kind of scenarios, and at the end of a process also reports about the future. But policymakers still see foresight as an uncertain kind of evidence and is not rigorous. There is not really legitimacy about the methods. And that's why then foresight maybe still are treated as one-off and disconnected from a more institutional kind of routine. So we to try to study and to analyze ways in which foresight can be counted as good evidence, and it can be, but there are some enablers that policymakers and government more in general should take into consideration. So let me move into this part. So first of all, the problem that we recognize with foresight and the knowledge that foresight produces in policymaking is that there is no shared standards for what is good foresight exercises and hence good foresight kind of evidence. First of all, because methods are evolving very rapidly. Nowadays, we see foresight done with LLMs or ChatGPT or avatars that assist foresight workshop in some way. So even here, we need still to reflect a lot on the standards and the methods for foresight. And then also the translations challenge. This is, as we said, important for policymakers to understand evidence and knowledge. So there is really a difficulty in turning foresight into actionable insight. And this is where I see a lot of potential for analysts and knowledge brokers, exactly in this link, in turning foresight into something that is actionable for policies. Then again, I already mentioned the fact that there is really a low future literacy around civil servants and policymakers. And when there is future literacy, there is no understanding. And so there is skepticism and there is low trust. And then the famous institutional barriers that public policy and policy design is always warning us. Foresight is still very much piecemeal here and there and weakly institutionalized inside governments. There are some champions we've seen, but in general, this is still a very big challenge. So some enablers we are reflecting on. First of all, robustness. So foresight needs a methodological credibility. And then again, when we are reflecting on integrating AI systems with foresight, well, this is something that is very important to be clear on how to do it, the goodness of the data that inform also foresight exercises. So clear explanation of the method used, the scenarios, the trends, the workshops, how they are conveyed, and transparency about that, about the sources. And then it has to be appropriate. So you cannot just use foresight for everything or just it has to be a purpose. It has to be actionable. And that's again a matter also of translating it. So you need clear guidance on how policymakers can use this insight or not. So translating the scenarios into relevant policy questions, relevant options. So clarity on the scope. Why are we doing that? Why this is useful? What is the policy problem? How can this insight from the foresight workshop help us redefine, reshape the policy problem? And then inclusivity. So foresight should always be an inclusive, as much as possible, exercise. As we know, it is built on critical knowledge and perspective that derive from a variety of actors and stakeholders. So wide participation across disciplines as much as possible, different sectors, different units, different demographics, and trying to avoid as much as possible the technical language that exclude, for instance, some stakeholders rather than others. This is really important to address exactly the challenge of transparency and translation that we observe. So a very good example of this, way of doing foresight and anticipation is ESPAS. ESPAS is a interinstitutional project of the EU that runs different horizon scanning and sense making exercises monthly with a variety of actors from different units of the EU, but also external to the EU's experts, academics, citizens. They can participate in scanning the horizon, in finding new trends, and then all this knowledge about the future is eventually translated, also thanks to the work of the Joint Research Center and the Policy Lab, into actionable insights, into reports on strategic foresight, especially after the COVID pandemic. Foresight in the EU has really become a very important aspect, with the Vice President Sefcovic having the mandate on foresight becoming one of the better regulation toolbox, and now the attention to the future generations aspects. So ESPAS is really, I mean, a very good example of all these challenges and enablers put in practice that we discuss also in another paper with my colleague, which is still not published. We find that ESPAS is very inclusive in the process in which they run their horizon scanning and sense-making exercises with this monthly workshop, very iterative production of signals and collection of the trends. It is also very robust in the methodology, in how the methodology is explained and run. And also, for instance, the Futurium has a very transparent repository of the data, the signals, and the insights. The only dimension that probably is a little bit weak is what we call the appropriateness, because the outputs of ESPAS and foresight reports are not always so clear in how they can be used by policymakers. So they are more informative and less normative in their scope. So this is something that could be probably changed. And then, yes, there is no systematic demographic diversity in the participants, but is very, very on a voluntary base. So it's also worth noticing that ESPAS is without a specific budget, so it's really on a base of different DGs and different experts and volunteers that do participate in this effort. So to really start concluding a little bit my hopefully useful seminar of today, I want to bring our attention to the regional and municipal dimension of governance, because anticipation is not just a supranational or national effort, but is really a lot about also regional and municipal. And this is very interesting. The Hauts-de-France region, French region, shows, for instance, how a region can really invest heavily in foresight capacity, building a dedicated unit and team that works directly with different municipalities within the region. With a team of 17 people, they will conduct a lot of research and efforts on the economic and social development of the region to support exactly the municipalities. But not all the regions follow the same path. Another interesting model, a little bit smaller, maybe more analytical, is the Flanders in Belgium, with a strategic foresight analysis unit and close collaboration with the OECD, and providing a lot of again, reports and publication on the future of the region. But foresight is not just about public administrations, is also activated in more in the redesign of very limited territorial space through very participatory methods. So we see now the case of Krakow and the neighborhood of and the future of Vesola. Again, the redesign and reconstruction of this part of Krakow is really the output of future-oriented project, very much participatory one, where future wheels, scenario workshop were led, very participated, and that led to the co-creation of a future-proof master plan for the city and Vesola in particular. So I decided to lead to the conclusion with these regional examples that I think show that anticipatory governance is not just a national, European, OECD effort. It's very much also regional and even municipal level. And that is also where foresight really is becoming a lot concrete and what it brings, because it shapes cities, it shapes the labor market. We've seen the industries, territories in general, the strategies of the territories. And this matters a lot because most implementation, most innovations seems to happen locally a lot. So very much the investment in capacity at the level of region I think is impressive. So seems at least impactful. Well, when linked, maybe, and this is something that we could maybe discuss together, when linked to very real policy problems and then limited policy decisions that needs to be taken. So the Eau de France, the territorial development, the strategic analysis of the Flanders, the planning, the urban planning of in Krakow. So I think that foresight ecosystems as this one do tend to emerge in when, of course, regions and municipalities embed a lot anticipation and co-production into everyday planning. So not when they just tend to produce this more occasional reports, and that's an exercise on foresight done. So it's really about the everyday kind of planning and redesign of these processes. So from imagining futures to governing futures, I just want to close with a few, few words. I hope that at least when we now step back from all the policy design and policy analysis insights, there is a message. I hope that that emerges, and that governments are striving and developing anticipatory capacities unevenly, sometimes not in an effective way, sometimes in an effective way, sometimes under very much pressure. Foresight on its own as a tool is not enough. It really becomes transformative when it is embedded in a system and into the design of processes and policies, of course, into the way in which problems are framed, instruments are chosen and designed, in which routines are built, in the way in which it is learning and evaluation also of policies. And I think that this is the challenge of design in general. So the design of institutional behavior, of the capacities, of the way of thinking of policymakers. So really, I do hope that today, hopefully was clear enough. You have seen how the two words of foresight and future studies and policy design are coming together, they are reinforcing each other, opening the future on the one hand and making it more governable and down to earth in a sense with what we know about policy making and policy design. So I think that with that, yes, I have finished my presentation.